I spent 43 years building this house, 43 years of sweat, overtime shifts, and sacrifices that most people today couldn't even comprehend. Every single board in these floors, every nail in these walls, every window that catches the morning light, I put them there with my own two hands. And I did it all for family. I did it all because I believed that family meant something sacred, something worth protecting. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I learned, what I survived, and what I'm about to tell you. Because if you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, maybe you're in a situation like mine. Maybe someone you trusted has turned on you. Maybe you feel invisible in your own home, disrespected in the space you built with your own blood and tears. And maybe, just maybe, you need to hear that you don't have to take it lying down. This house sits on 3 acres of land I bought in 1961 for $12,000. Back then, that was everything my wife, Margaret, and I had saved. Everything. We had been married for 6 years, living in a cramped apartment above a hardware store, saving every penny we could scrape together. Margaret worked as a seamstress, her fingers raw from needle pricks, her eyes straining under dim lights as she worked late into the night. I worked construction during the day and did handyman jobs on weekends. We had a coffee can in the back of our closet where we'd put whatever we could spare. $5 here, $10 there. Sometimes just loose change. When we finally had enough for the down payment on this land, Margaret cried. I mean, really cried. Not just tears, but full body sobs of relief and joy. She had grown up in foster care, bounced between 7 different homes before she aged out of the system. The idea of having a permanent place, a real home that nobody could take away from us, it meant everything to her. It meant stability. It meant roots. It meant we could start the family we both desperately wanted. We broke ground on this house in the spring of 1962. I was 31 years old and Margaret was 29. We couldn't afford contractors, couldn't afford to hire out any of the work, so I did it myself. Every weekend, every vacation day, every spare moment I had, my brother-in-law helped with the framing. My best friend from high school, Tommy, he knew electrical work, so he came by evenings after his own job to run the wiring. Margaret's aunt knew plumbing, and she taught me everything I needed to know, standing there in the foundation trench in her rubber boots, showing me how to sweat copper pipes. It took us 3 years to get this house livable. 3 years of living in that cramped apartment while I poured every ounce of myself into these walls. My hands were constantly bandaged. I lost a fingernail when a hammer slipped. I fell off the roof twice, once breaking 2 ribs that I worked through because I couldn't afford to take time off. Margaret would come out after her seamstress work and help however she could, holding boards steady, passing me tools, painting trim. On Sundays, we'd pack a lunch and spend the entire day here, working side by side, dreaming about the life we'd have once we could finally move in. We moved into this house on Margaret's 32nd birthday, November 14th, 1965. The house wasn't finished, not by a long shot. We had plywood subflooring, no interior doors yet, and half the walls were still just studs. But we had a roof over our heads that was ours. Margaret stood in the middle of what would become our living room, turned in a slow circle, and said, "We did it, baby. We actually did it." Then she put her hand on her stomach and told me she was pregnant. Our daughter Sarah was born 7 months later, right here in this house. Not by choice, mind you. Margaret went into labor 3 weeks early, and it happened so fast we didn't make it to the hospital. I delivered my own daughter in our bedroom at 2:30 in the morning with a 911 operator talking me through it over the phone. When I heard that first cry, when I held that tiny, perfect little girl in my hands, I made a promise. I promised that she would always have a home, that she would always have security, that she would never know the fear and instability that Margaret had known growing up. Over the next 15 years, I finished this house. Every detail was intentional, every choice made with love. I built custom cabinets in the kitchen because Margaret loved to cook and wanted specific storage for her baking supplies. I put in big windows on the east side so the morning sun would fill the house with light because Margaret hated waking up in darkness. I built a workshop in the garage where I could teach Sarah how to use tools, how to fix things, how to be self-reliant. I planted an apple tree in the backyard the year Sarah turned 5, and I built her a tree house in it when she turned 8. This wasn't just a house, this was a living, breathing monument to love, to commitment, to the belief that hard work and sacrifice meant something. Every room held memories. The kitchen where Margaret taught Sarah how to make her grandmother's biscuit recipe. The living room where we'd have movie nights every Friday, all 3 of us crowded on the couch with popcorn. The front porch where Sarah would sit with her homework on summer evenings while Margaret and I would swing on the porch swing, holding hands, watching the sunset paint the sky. Sarah grew up strong and smart. She went to state college on a partial scholarship, worked part-time to cover the rest, graduated with a degree in marketing, met a man named David during her junior year. He seemed nice enough at first. Polite, came from a good family, had a decent job lined up after graduation. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. Margaret and I, we had some reservations. Nothing concrete, just a feeling. The way he'd sometimes talk over Sarah, the way he'd make decisions without consulting her, the way he'd change the subject whenever she talked about her career plans. But Sarah loved him, and we wanted her to be happy, so we kept our mouths shut and smiled at the wedding. I walked my daughter down the aisle in June of 1988, right here in the backyard of this house under the apple tree I'd planted for her. Margaret had spent months planning that wedding, had sewn Sarah's dress by hand, every single bead and pearl placed with love. It was a beautiful day. It should have been perfect. David moved into our house temporarily after the wedding, just until they saved enough for a down payment on their own place. That was the agreement. 6 months, maybe a year at most. They'd take the guest room, save money on rent, build up their savings. Margaret and I, we were happy to help. That's what family does, right? You help each other out. You give your kids a boost when they need it, but 6 months turned into a year turned into 2. Every time we'd gently ask about their house hunting progress, David would have an excuse. The market was too expensive, interest rates were too high, they were waiting for Sarah to get a promotion, always something, and gradually I didn't even notice it happening. At first, David started acting like this was his house instead of ours. He'd rearrange furniture without asking. He'd complain about meals Margaret cooked. He'd leave his stuff everywhere, shoes in the hallway, jackets on the dining room chairs, tools he'd borrowed from my workshop scattered around the property and never returned. When I'd mention it, he'd laugh it off or make a joke about me being a neat freak. Sarah would apologize for him, say he was stressed about work, promise it wouldn't happen again, but it always did. Then in 1992, Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4 by the time they found it. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 8, and every single day of those 8 months was agony. The woman who had never complained about anything, who had worked through poverty and hardship with grace and determination, was reduced to a shell of herself, eaten away from the inside by a disease that showed no mercy. I took care of her every single day. I bathed her. When she couldn't stand, I carried her to the bathroom. I held her hair back when the chemo made her sick. I read to her when she couldn't sleep. I held her hand through the pain and the fear and the anger at the unfairness of it all. Sarah helped when she could, but she was working full-time, and honestly, I wanted to do it. Margaret was my wife, my partner, my best friend for 37 years. Taking care of her was the last gift I could give her. David barely acknowledged what was happening. He'd come home from work, nod in the direction of our bedroom where Margaret was dying, then go straight to the guest room or turn on the TV. He never offered to help, never asked if I needed anything, never showed an ounce of compassion or support. And when I'd suggest maybe he could sit with Margaret for an hour so I could run to the pharmacy or the grocery store, he'd say he didn't want to intrude on private family time, as if he wasn't family, as if sitting with a dying woman for 60 minutes was some kind of unreasonable burden. Margaret died on March the 3rd, 1993 at 4:47 in the morning. I was lying next to her, holding her hand when she took her last breath. Sarah was on the other side of the bed, crying quietly. David was asleep in the guest room. He didn't even wake up, didn't come out until almost 8 o'clock, walking into the kitchen expecting breakfast like it was any other day. When Sarah told him her mother had passed, he said, "Oh, that's rough," and poured himself a cup of coffee. We buried Margaret in the cemetery 10 miles from here, under an oak tree with a view of the mountains she loved. I bought the plot next to hers for myself. Sarah and I designed the headstone together. On it we had them engrave Margaret Ann, beloved wife and mother. She built a home with love. At the funeral, 73 people showed up, friends from her seamstress days, neighbors, people from our church, Sarah's friends who remembered Margaret as the mom who always had fresh cookies and an open door. David spent most of the service on his phone. After Margaret died, something in me broke. Not just grief, though, that was crushing enough, but purpose. For 37 years, every single thing I'd done had been for her, for us, for the family we'd built together. And now she was gone, and I was alone in this house that we'd built together, surrounded by memories of a life that felt like it had ended along with hers. Sarah suggested I see a therapist. I went a few times, but talking to a stranger about my feelings seemed pointless. What was I supposed to say? That I missed my wife? That I felt lost without her? That every morning I woke up and forgot for just a second that she was gone, and then reality would crash back and I'd have to remember all over again that she wasn't there? Nobody could fix that. No amount of talking was going to bring Margaret back. So I did what I've always done. I kept going. I kept maintaining the house. I kept going to work, though I was close to retirement age and probably could have stopped. I kept eating, sleeping, existing. I wasn't living, not really, but I was surviving. And that felt like the best I could manage. David and Sarah were still in the guest room. They'd been here almost 5 years by this point, and I'd stopped asking when they were going to move out. It seemed cruel to push the issue so soon after Margaret's death. Sarah was grieving too, and I didn't want to add stress to her pain. So they stayed, and I told myself it was temporary, that eventually they'd get their own place, and I'd have my house back to myself to grieve in private. About 6 months after Margaret's funeral, Sarah came to me and said they were pregnant. She was crying when she told me, happy tears mixed with fear. She said, "I wish Mom was here to meet her grandchild." I held my daughter and told her Margaret would have been thrilled, which was true. Margaret had always wanted grandchildren. We'd talked about it often, about how we'd spoil them, teach them things, watch them grow up in this house the same way Sarah had. I told Sarah and David, congratulations. I told them they could stay here until the baby was born, help them save money for their own place so they could move out with a cushion of savings. It seemed like the right thing to do, the generous thing, the thing Margaret would have wanted. But something shifted after that conversation. Something subtle, but unmistakable. David started making comments about the house, about how the nursery would need to be painted, about how they'd need more space for baby stuff, about how this would be a great house to raise a child in, almost wistfully, like he was imagining a future here. Not a temporary future, a permanent one. I didn't say anything at first. I figured I was being paranoid, reading too much into casual comments. But the comments kept coming about how they'd need to baby-proof the house, about which room would make the best playroom, about how the backyard was perfect for a swing set. Always they'd need to and they'd want to, never when we have our own place or in our future home. Sarah gave birth to my grandson, Ethan, in February 1994. He was a beautiful baby, healthy and strong, with Sarah's eyes and a full head of dark hair. I held him in the hospital, looked down at his tiny, perfect face, and felt something I hadn't felt since Margaret died: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. This was Margaret's legacy. This was proof that what we'd built together continued, that our love hadn't ended with her death but lived on in this new generation. I told Sarah I'd build Ethan a treehouse when he got old enough, the same way I'd built one for her. I told her about all the things I wanted to teach him, show him, share with him. She smiled and thanked me, but there was something in her eyes, something hesitant, almost guilty. I didn't understand it then, but I would soon enough. They brought Ethan home from the hospital, and suddenly the guest room wasn't enough space. They needed the second bedroom for the nursery. That was fine. I told them use it. It was just sitting empty anyway. So we moved the guest bed into the basement, and Sarah and David set up a nursery. They painted it yellow and white, bought a crib and a changing table and a rocking chair. I helped assemble furniture, hung up shelves, installed a dimmer on the light switch. It felt good to be useful, to be needed, to have a purpose again. But then David started talking about the master bedroom, about how it was the biggest room in the house, about how it had the attached bathroom, about how convenient it would be for late night feedings to have Ethan's nursery right next door. He never said it directly, never explicitly suggested that I should give up my bedroom, but the implication was clear. He was measuring it, planning it, imagining their family in that space. I shut that down immediately. I told David clearly and firmly that the master bedroom was off limits. That was my room, mine and Margaret's. That's where we'd slept for 28 years. That's where she died in my arms. That room was sacred, and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. David smiled and said he understood. Of course he understood. He'd never dream of asking me to give up my room, but his eyes said something different. His eyes said, "We'll see about that." For the first year of Ethan's life, things were tense but manageable. I did what I'd always done, went to work, came home, helped out where I could. I'd hold Ethan while Sarah napped, changed diapers, do late-night feedings. Being a grandfather brought me back to life in ways I didn't expect. Every smile from that baby, every laugh, every milestone felt like a gift. But David grew more and more comfortable, more entitled. He started calling this house our place instead of your dad's place. Started making decisions about paint colors, about landscaping, about repairs, without asking me. When I'd object, he'd say he was just trying to help, just trying to take some burden off my shoulders, just trying to make the house better for everyone. Sarah would apologize for him, make excuses, try to smooth things over. She was caught in the middle, and I didn't want to make her life harder. She was a new mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, and I remembered how hard those early years were. So I bit my tongue. I let things slide that I shouldn't have let slide. I convinced myself it was temporary, that once Ethan was a little older, they'd finally move out and things would go back to normal. Then I retired. After 45 years of construction work, my body was giving out. My back was shot, my knees were gone, my hands had arthritis so bad some days I could barely grip a coffee cup. I was 64 years old and I was done. I filed for Social Security and my pension, cleaned out my locker at the construction site, and came home for what I thought would be a peaceful retirement. Being home all day changed everything. I started noticing things I'd missed when I was at work. I saw how David treated this house, how he'd leave messes for Sarah to clean up, how he'd track mud through the rooms Margaret and I had carefully maintained, how he'd use my tools and not put them back, how He'd help himself to my food and belongings without asking. I saw how he'd talk to Sarah, dismissive and condescending, especially when she disagreed with him about anything. And I saw how he looked at me, with impatience, with annoyance, like I was an inconvenience, an obstacle, something to be tolerated rather than respected. I was in his way, taking up space in the house he'd decided was his. One day, about 6 months after I retired, I was in the garage organizing my workshop. David came out and started looking through my tools. He picked up my table saw, one I'd bought decades ago, one of my most prized possessions. He said, "This is pretty old. You should probably upgrade. When are you planning to sell this stuff?" I asked him what he meant by when. He shrugged and said, you're retired now. You're not building anything anymore. This is all just taking up space. Might as well sell it, make some money, clear out the garage." He said it so casually, like my tools, my life's work, my connection to every project I'd ever completed were just junk to be discarded. I told him I wasn't selling anything. These were my tools, this was my workshop, this was my garage and my house. He smiled that smile of his, the one that doesn't reach his eyes, and said, sure. I'm just thinking about the future, about what makes sense for the family." Then he walked away, leaving my tools scattered across the workbench instead of putting them back where he'd found them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bed Margaret and I had shared, staring at the ceiling, and a horrible realization crept into my mind. David didn't see this as my house anymore. He saw it as his house that I just happened to still be living in. He was waiting for me to die, waiting for me to become so old and feeble I couldn't object to anything, waiting for his opportunity to take complete control. I told myself I was being paranoid. David was my son-in-law, Sarah's husband, Ethan's father. He wouldn't actually try to take my house, but that thought, once planted, grew roots. And over the next several months, I started paying closer attention, started watching, started noticing patterns. David would have phone conversations in the backyard, pacing back and forth, talking in low tones I couldn't quite hear. When I'd walk outside, he'd quickly end the call. When I'd ask who he was talking to, he'd say, "Work stuff," or "Nobody important." Sarah started seeming stressed, withdrawn. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd say she was just tired, just adjusting to motherhood, just stressed about money. Money. That was the other thing I noticed. David had a decent job in sales, and Sarah had gone back to her marketing position part-time when Ethan turned 1. Between both their incomes and not paying rent, they should have been building up substantial savings. But whenever I'd ask about their house hunting progress, they'd say they didn't have enough saved yet. Where was their money going? I started finding documents. Not snooping, just finding things left out where I could see them. Credit card statements with huge balances, loan applications, refinancing paperwork. And one day I found something that made my blood run cold. A property assessment document for my house, with David's name on it as the requester. He was having my house appraised, without my knowledge, without my permission. Why would he do that unless he was planning something? I confronted him that evening, asked him directly why he'd ordered a property assessment on my house. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He said he was just being smart, just planning ahead, just trying to understand the family assets. Family assets. Like my house. The house I'd built with my own hands was some kind of joint property instead of mine alone. I told him this was my house. I said it clearly, loudly, with no room for misunderstanding. I told him that I'd built this place, I'd paid for this place, my name was on the deed, and no amount of him living here temporarily gave him any claim to it. He smiled and said he understood. Of course, he wasn't trying to claim anything, he was just being financially prudent, just thinking about the future. But I knew. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that David was planning to take my house. I didn't know how yet, didn't understand the mechanism, but I knew the way he looked at me with that calm, condescending smile. The way he spoke like he was explaining something to a confused child. The way he dismissed my objections like they were unreasonable overreactions to something perfectly innocent. I went to Sarah that night, after David had gone to bed. I told her about the property assessment, about my concerns, about the feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. She listened, and I saw conflict in her eyes. She wasn't surprised, which told me she knew something. But when I asked her directly if David was planning something, she got defensive. She said I was being paranoid, said David was just being responsible, said I was making something out of nothing. She said David loved me, respected me, would never do anything to hurt me, but she wouldn't look me in the eyes when she said it, and I knew she was either lying or lying to herself. That's when I knew I couldn't trust Sarah to be on my side. It broke my heart, realizing my own daughter had been pulled into whatever David was planning. She wasn't part of it, maybe didn't even fully understand it, but she'd chosen her husband over her father. She'd chosen to believe his lies instead of trusting her instincts. I was alone, 64 years old, grieving my wife, and realizing that the family I'd sacrificed everything for was turning against me. The house I'd built with love was becoming a prison. The legacy I'd tried to create was being stolen out from under me. But I wasn't dead yet, and I wasn't going to just roll over and let them take everything Margaret and I had built. If David wanted a war, if he wanted to try to steal my home, my security, my legacy, then I was going to fight back. I might be getting older, but I'm not stupid. I might be grieving, but I'm not weak. I've survived poverty, loss, and 45 years of backbreaking labor. I've built a house with my own two hands and raised a daughter and buried my wife. I've faced down bigger challenges than some entitled son-in-law who thinks he can manipulate his way into stealing what I've earned. David had made a mistake. He'd underestimated me. He'd assumed that because I was quiet, because I was grieving, because I was getting older, I was also passive. He'd assumed I would just accept whatever he decided to do. He'd assumed wrong. I decided that night that I was going to find out exactly what David was planning. I was going to gather evidence, document everything, and when the time was right, I was going to destroy whatever scheme he was building, not with violence, not with emotion, but with cold, calculated precision. Margaret used to tell me I was stubborn. She'd say it with love, with exasperation, with pride. She'd say, once I set my mind to something, there was no stopping me. Well, I'd set my mind to this. I was going to protect what we'd built. I was going to honor her memory. I was going to make sure that this house, this legacy, this monument to our love didn't end up in the hands of someone who saw it as nothing more than a financial asset to exploit. The war had begun. David just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I started my investigation. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I needed to understand what David was planning. I needed proof. I needed documentation. Because one thing I'd learned in 45 years of construction work is that you can't build anything solid without a strong foundation. And I couldn't fight back against something I didn't fully understand. I started with the basics. I went through my own paperwork first, making sure everything was in order. The deed to the house was in a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, along with Margaret's death certificate, my will, and other important documents. Everything was as it should be. The house was solely in my name. Margaret and I had owned it jointly, but when she died, full ownership transferred to me automatically. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no legal gray area. This was my house, free and clear. But David having that property assessment done meant something. You don't get an appraisal on someone else's property for no reason. So I started digging into what that might mean. I spent hours at the library using their computers to research property law, inheritance law, elder law. I'd never been much for computers, always preferred working with my hands, but I learned. When you're fighting for your life, you learn fast. What I found terrified me. I learned about something called undue influence. I learned about how family members can manipulate elderly relatives into signing over property. I learned about financial exploitation of the elderly. I learned about guardianship and conservatorship, how someone could petition the court to take control of your affairs if they could prove you were incompetent. I learned about adverse possession, about property rights, about estate planning, and probate. And the more I learned, the more I realized how vulnerable I was. I was a 64-year-old widower living with my daughter and son-in-law. I had no other family nearby. I was isolated. If David wanted to claim I was senile, who would contradict him? If he wanted to say I couldn't take care of myself, who would stand up for me? Sarah was the only witness to my daily life, and she'd already shown she'd take David's side over mine. I needed allies. I needed someone outside the house who could verify my competence, my independence, my sound mind. So I started rebuilding connections I'd let atrophy after Margaret died. I called my old friend Tommy, the one who'd helped me wire the house 33 years ago. We'd fallen out of touch after Margaret's funeral, mostly because I'd isolated myself in my grief. But Tommy answered on the second ring, and when I told him I needed his help, he didn't hesitate. We met for coffee at a diner halfway between our houses. I hadn't seen Tommy in almost 2 years, and he looked older, but then so did I. Time doesn't stop for any of us. I told him everything about David, about the property assessment, about my concerns. Tommy listened, his face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You need a lawyer? Today, right now? This isn't something you can handle on your own." I told him I didn't want to escalate things, didn't want to make this into a legal battle. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "It's already a legal battle. David fired the first shot when he got that appraisal. You're just finally returning fire." Tommy had a nephew who was an attorney, specialized in elder law and estate planning. Tommy called him right there from the diner, explained the situation, and got me an appointment for the next day. Then Tommy made me promise to keep him updated, to call him if I needed anything, to not try to handle this alone. He said Margaret would haunt him if he let anything happen to me. That almost made me smile because he was right. Margaret would have absolutely haunted anyone who didn't look out for me. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about the day Margaret and I broke ground on this house. I thought about teaching Sarah to ride a bike in the driveway. I thought about Margaret's last breath, the way her hand went slack in mine. I thought about holding Ethan for the first time. And I thought about how everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, was being threatened by a man who'd contributed nothing but lived off our generosity for years. The anger that burned in my chest kept me awake until dawn. Not hot, explosive anger. Cold, focused anger. The kind of anger that doesn't make you do stupid things. The kind of anger that makes you strategic, patient, calculating. David wanted my house. He was going to have to go through hell to get it. And I was going to make sure that journey destroyed him. The next afternoon, I told David and Sarah I was going out for a while. Needed to run some errands. Sarah asked if I needed company. I said no, I was fine. Just some boring stuff at the bank and the hardware store. She accepted that without question, went back to playing with Ethan. David didn't even look up from his phone. I drove to Tommy's nephew's office in the city, a 40-minute drive through traffic that gave me too much time to think. The office was on the third floor of a modern building, all glass and steel, very different from the world I was used to. The receptionist was young and professional, offered me water, told me Mr. Harrison would be with me shortly. James Harrison was in his mid-40s, tall and well-dressed, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He led me to his office, offered me a seat, and asked me to tell him everything. So I did. I told him about Margaret, about building the house, about David and Sarah moving in temporarily that turned permanent, about The property assessment about my fears, I told him about finding the credit card statements and loan applications, about David's comments about my tools in the garage, about the way he talked about family assets. James took notes, asked clarifying questions, didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Mr. Peterson, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You're in a vulnerable position. You're right to be concerned. What you're describing sounds like the early stages of financial exploitation." Hearing it out loud, hearing a professional confirm my fears, felt like being punched in the stomach. James continued, "The good news is that you're ahead of this. You've recognized what's happening before any actual legal action has been taken. That gives us time to protect you and your assets." He outlined a plan. First, update my will to make my intentions crystal clear. Second, establish a durable power of attorney for healthcare and finances with someone I trusted who wasn't David or Sarah. Third, document everything David did or said that raised concerns. Fourth, consider a trust to protect the house from any potential claims. I asked him about the property assessment. James said, "That's concerning. There are a few reasons someone might get an appraisal on property they don't own. None of them are good. He might be planning to pressure you into selling and splitting the proceeds. He might be calculating what he'd inherit if you died. He might be trying to establish some kind of claim. Or he might be planning to take out a loan using your property as collateral, which would require him to commit fraud, but wouldn't be the first time I've seen it." Fraud. The word hung in the air like poison. My son-in-law might be planning to commit fraud against me, to steal my house through forgery and deception. I felt sick. James asked if I'd given David access to any of my financial information. I said no, everything was locked in my safe. He asked if David had ever asked me to sign anything. I thought back and realized, yes, about 6 months ago, David had brought me some papers he said were for the household records, just insurance updates and utility stuff. I'd signed without reading them carefully because I trusted him, because he was family. James's face went grim. He said, "I need you to find out what those papers were." It's possible they were exactly what he said. It's also possible you signed something you didn't understand. Power of attorney, property transfer documents, loan applications. I've seen it all. He gave me homework. Find those papers. Find any and all documents David had asked me to sign. Bring them to our next appointment. I left James's office feeling both better and worse. Better because I had a professional on my side, someone who understood the law and could help me. Worse because the severity of the situation had been confirmed. This wasn't me being paranoid or oversensitive. This was real. I was really being targeted by my own family. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. I needed to find those papers David had given me. I needed to know what I'd signed, but I couldn't let David know I was investigating him. I had to play it cool, act normal, pretend everything was fine while I built my case. When I got home, Sarah was making dinner. Ethan was in his high chair, smashing crackers into paste like toddlers do. David was on the couch watching TV. Everything looked normal, domestic, peaceful. But underneath the surface, there was a war brewing, and only I knew it. I went to my room, closed the door, and started searching. I looked through every drawer, every file, every stack of papers. I found old utility bills, medical records, insurance policies. But I couldn't find whatever David had given me to sign 6 months ago. I searched for 2 hours, growing more frantic until I had to stop because Sarah called me for dinner. At dinner, I watched David, studied him. He ate Sarah's pot roast and made conversation about his day at work and played peekaboo with Ethan. He looked like a normal husband and father, but I knew better now. I'd seen behind the mask. And once you see someone for who they really are, you can never unsee it. After dinner, I offered to do the dishes. Sarah protested, said I was a guest in my own home, which was both sweet and ironic. But I insisted, and she relented, took Ethan upstairs for his bath. David went back to the TV, and I stood at the sink, washing dishes, planning my next move. That night, after everyone was asleep, I went downstairs to David and Sarah's bedroom. I'd never violated their privacy before, never snooped in their space. But this was different. This was survival. I needed to find those papers. I needed to know what I'd signed. I moved quietly, carefully, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would wake someone. I checked their dresser drawers, their closet, under their bed. Nothing. Then I saw David's briefcase in the corner of the room. It was locked, but it was a cheap combination lock. I'd worked with locks my whole life. I had it open in less than 2 minutes. Inside the briefcase was a goldmine of information. Bank statements showing David and Sarah had almost $20,000 in credit card debt, loan applications that had been denied, a file labeled property documents that made my blood run cold. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and started reading. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. David had compiled a complete dossier on my house. He had the original property assessment. He had comparables from other houses in the area. He had calculations of the equity. He had notes about the condition of the house, needed repairs, potential sale price. He had a timeline that made me want to vomit. According to his notes, the plan was simple. Live rent-free and build up debt that they'd claim was for household expenses. Document anytime I seemed forgetful or confused. Create a narrative that I was declining mentally and couldn't care for myself. Then either pressure me into signing over the house for my own good so they could take care of me, or petition for guardianship and take control that way. Once they had control, sell the house, pay off their debts, buy a smaller place, and put me in a nursing home with whatever was left. There was more. David had been in contact with a real estate agent, had gotten pre-approval for a mortgage on a different property contingent on proceeds from the sale of my house, had researched nursing homes in the area and their costs. This wasn't a vague plan. This was detailed, calculated, and already in motion. I took pictures of everything with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Every page, every note, every calculation. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, relocked the briefcase, and got out of their room. Back in my own room, I sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 28 years, and I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I cried hard, ugly tears of betrayal and grief and rage. My daughter's husband was planning to steal my house, erase my independence, and warehouse me in a nursing home to die among strangers. And Sarah either knew and approved or was being manipulated into going along with it. Everything I'd built, everything Margaret and I had sacrificed for, was under attack. And the attack was coming from inside my own family, the people I'd trusted most in the world. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the photos of David's documents burning in my phone like evidence of the worst kind of betrayal. When dawn came, I was already up, already planning. I called James Harrison's office the moment they opened and told his receptionist I needed an emergency appointment. I had evidence, proof, documentation of everything. James cleared his schedule and saw me at 11. I showed him the photos. He went through each one carefully, his expression growing darker with every swipe. When he finished, he said 3 words: "This is elder abuse." He explained that what David was doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud, potentially even theft, depending on what I'd actually signed. James said we had several options. We could go to the police, we could pursue a civil case, we could get a restraining order, or we could play a longer game, let David think his plan was working while we built an ironclad legal defense that would destroy him when he finally made his move. I chose the long game. I didn't want to just stop David. I wanted to destroy him. I wanted him to lose everything. I wanted him to face consequences for trying to steal from me, for betraying the trust of the family that had supported him for years. I wanted justice and I wanted revenge. James helped me formulate a plan. First, I'd update my will and create a trust. Everything would go to Sarah, but she'd only receive it after my death, and David would have no claim to any of it. The trust would protect the house from any attempt by David to force a sale or take out loans against it. Second, I'd establish power of attorney with Tommy, who James would help me verify as competent and trustworthy. Third, I'd document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every attempt by David to manipulate or pressure me. But here's the key part, the part that made me feel like I was finally fighting back. I'd pretend to go along with David's plan. I'd start acting a little forgetful, a little confused. I'd make him think his strategy was working. And when he finally made his move, tried to get me to sign over the house or petitioned for guardianship, I'd pull the rug out from under him with all my documentation proving I was of sound mind and he was a predator. James warned me it was risky. He said if I played the role too well, I might actually give David ammunition to use against me, but I was confident I could walk that line. I'd worked construction for 45 years. I knew how to follow a plan, how to execute with precision, how to see a project through from start to finish. This was just another project, the most important project of my life. We spent 3 hours in James's office that day, going through every detail. He drafted a new will and trust documents. He prepared power of attorney paperwork. He gave me a small recording device, no bigger than a USB drive, and told me to keep it in my pocket at all times, record every interaction with David. He gave me a secure email address where I could send him updates and documentation. He gave me his personal cell phone number and told me to call day or night if I felt unsafe. When I left his office, I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. I was armed now. I had a strategy. I had allies. I had documentation. David thought he was hunting a confused old man. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. Over the next few weeks, I started playing my role. I'd occasionally forget where I'd put my keys, make a big show of looking for them, then find them somewhere obvious. I'd ask Sarah the same question twice in one day. I'd call David by the wrong name, then correct myself with an embarrassed laugh. Nothing too dramatic, nothing that would raise red flags, just enough to feed the narrative David was already trying to build. And I watched how David reacted when I seemed confused. He'd get this look in his eyes, satisfied and eager, like a predator seeing its prey stumble. He'd exchange glances with Sarah. He'd make comments like, "Are you feeling okay? You seem a little off lately," concerned on the surface, calculating underneath. Sarah's reactions were harder to read. Sometimes she seemed genuinely worried about me. Other times she seemed stressed, guilty, like she knew something wrong was happening but couldn't or wouldn't stop it. I wanted to believe my daughter was innocent, that she was being manipulated by David, but her complicity, whether active or passive, hurt more than anything David did. David was a snake. I'd known that for years, but Sarah was my daughter, my little girl. The baby I'd delivered in this house with my own hands. Her betrayal cut deeper than any knife. I kept recording everything, every conversation, every interaction. I'd download the recordings to a laptop I'd bought and kept hidden in my room, then email them to James. I documented times and dates, made notes of concerning behaviors. I was building a case, piece by piece, the same way I'd built this house, brick by brick. One evening, about a month into my performance, David came to me with more papers. He said they were for updating my insurance, needed my signature for the policy to remain active. The concerned son-in-law just trying to help his aging father-in-law stay protected. But I'd learned my lesson. I told him I'd look them over and sign them tomorrow, needed my reading glasses to see the fine print. He seemed annoyed, but agreed. That night, I photographed every page and sent them to James. The next morning, James called me. Those weren't insurance documents. They were financial power of attorney papers that would give David complete control over my bank accounts and assets. If I'd signed them, he could have cleaned me out, sold the house, done whatever he wanted, and it would have been completely legal because I'd have given him the authority to do it. James told me not to sign them, obviously. Tell David I decided I wanted to review them with my own insurance agent first. So that's what I did. David's face, when I told him, the flash of anger before he covered it with that fake smile, that told me everything I needed to know. He knew I was onto him, or at least he suspected I wasn't as confused and pliable as I was pretending to be. Things escalated after that. David started pushing harder. He'd bring up how difficult it was to maintain the house, how expensive repairs were getting, how maybe I should consider downsizing to something more manageable. He'd talk about senior communities, about how nice they were, how many activities and friends I could have. He painted nursing homes like vacation resorts, all while calculating how much profit he'd make from selling my house. Sarah started joining in. She'd talk about how worried she was about me living alone in such a big house, about what would happen if I fell and couldn't reach a phone, about how much easier it would be if I was somewhere with medical staff nearby. She'd cry, tell me she couldn't bear the thought of something happening to me, and maybe part of her meant it. Maybe she really was worried, but her solution to that worry was to support her husband stealing my home and autonomy. I played along. I'd nod thoughtfully, say I'd think about it, act like I was considering their suggestions, all while recording every word, documenting every manipulation tactic, building my case stronger and stronger. Then David made a mistake, a big one. He got greedy and impatient. I came home from a doctor's appointment one afternoon to find David in my bedroom. He was at my closet and the safe door was open. The safe where I kept the deed to the house, my will, all my important documents. He'd somehow gotten the combination or figured it out, and he was going through my papers. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He smiled and said he was just looking for my insurance papers, wanted to make sure everything was up to date. But I could see the deed in his hands. I could see my will spread out on the bed. He'd been going through everything, probably photographing it all like I'd photographed his documents. I didn't confront him, not yet. I just stood there, looking at him, letting him see in my eyes that I knew exactly what he was doing. Then I walked past him, took the deed from his hands, put everything back in the safe, and closed it. I didn't say a word, didn't need to. The message was clear. I see you. David left the room quickly after that. I heard him and Sarah having a heated, whispered conversation downstairs. I heard my name. I heard the words stubborn and running out of time and other options. I recorded all of it from the top of the stairs. That night, I called James and told him what had happened. He said we needed to move faster. David was getting desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. James filed the new will and trust documents the next day. He had me sign power of attorney over to Tommy in a formal witness setting at his office. He helped me open a new bank account that David couldn't access and transfer most of my money into it, leaving just enough in the old account to cover monthly bills without raising suspicion. The next morning, I went to a locksmith and had the combination on my safe changed. I made sure I was the only one who knew the new code. I wrote it down and gave a copy to Tommy, sealed in an envelope for safekeeping. We were preparing for the end game. David was going to make his move soon. I could feel it in the air, the tension building like a storm about to break. And when he did, I'd be ready. I'd destroy him so completely, he'd never financially recover. I'd expose him to Sarah, to the world, to anyone who would listen. I'd make sure everyone knew what kind of man he really was. But there was still more he was planning. More I didn't know yet, and what I was about to discover would make everything else look minor by comparison. The real depth of David's betrayal was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered, and when I found it, when I finally understood the full scope of what he'd been doing, it would take every ounce of self-control I had not to kill him with my bare hands. 2 days after I caught David in my safe and changed the combination, I got a call from the bank. My bank, the one I'd been using for 34 years, where everyone knew me by name. The manager, Linda Chen, asked if I could come in to discuss some concerning activity on my account. My stomach dropped. I told her I'd be there within the hour. Linda met me in her office, closed the door, and showed me what had triggered the alert. Someone had attempted to take out a home equity line of credit against my house. $50,000. The application had my signature on it, my personal information, everything. But I hadn't applied for any loan. I told Linda that clearly, emphatically. She believed me. She'd known me for decades, knew I'd never carried debt, knew this wasn't something I'd do. She pulled up the security footage from the branch. The person who'd submitted the application was David. He'd come in 3 days ago, papers in hand, claiming he was helping me with my finances because I was having some memory issues. The teller, who didn't know me personally, had accepted the application and started processing it. It was only when it went through the automated fraud detection system that red flags went up. The signature didn't quite match samples on file. The request was unusual for my account history. Linda had personally stopped the process and called me. I sat in her office looking at security footage of my son-in-law trying to steal $50,000 from me using my house as collateral, and something inside me went cold and hard as stone. This wasn't just about taking my house anymore. This was active, aggressive fraud. This was criminal, and I was going to make sure he paid for every single second of the pain and violation he'd caused. Linda asked if I wanted to file a police report. I told her yes, absolutely, but I needed to consult with my attorney first. She understood. She flagged my accounts with additional security measures, required in-person verification with photo ID for any transactions, over $500 added verbal password requirements. She made it nearly impossible for David to access my money. Then she gave me copies of everything. The fraudulent application, the security footage, the timestamps, all of it. I drove straight to James Harrison's office. I didn't call ahead, just showed up, and his receptionist saw the look on my face and got me in to see him immediately. I showed him everything Linda had given me. James looked through it all, his expression grave, and said what I already knew. This is felony fraud, identity theft, forgery. We can have him arrested. But I didn't want him arrested, not yet. I wanted more. I wanted him completely destroyed. I wanted him to lose everything, not just face criminal charges, but lose his job, his reputation, his marriage, his future. I wanted the punishment to fit the crime, and the crime wasn't just the attempted fraud, it was years of manipulation, of living off my generosity while plotting to steal everything, of using my grief and loneliness against me, of turning my daughter into either an accomplice or a victim. James understood. He'd seen enough of these cases to know that sometimes the legal system alone isn't enough for true justice. He said we could wait, build the case even stronger, catch David in the act of something even more damning. But we needed to be smart about it. We needed to move fast before David tried something else, something that might actually succeed. We formulated the final phase of the plan. James would prepare a comprehensive legal package, cease and desist letter, restraining order paperwork, criminal complaint, civil lawsuit for emotional distress, and attempted theft. We'd gather every piece of evidence we had, recordings, documents, bank records, witness statements. We'd present it all at once, an avalanche that David couldn't escape from, but first I needed to know the full truth. I needed to know if Sarah was truly complicit or if she was as much a victim as I was. I needed to give her one last chance to choose the right side. So I planned a conversation with her without David present where I'd lay everything out and see how she reacted. The opportunity came 2 days later. David had a weekend sales conference 3 hours away. He'd be gone for 2 nights. Sarah seemed stressed before he left, like she didn't want to be alone with me, which told me she knew something was very wrong, but she didn't have a choice. David left Friday afternoon, and it was just Sarah, me, and Ethan in the house. That evening, after Sarah put Ethan to bed, I asked her to sit down with me. I told her we needed to talk. She got this panicked look in her eyes like she knew what was coming, but she sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where Margaret and I had eaten thousands of meals, the same table where we'd helped Sarah with homework, the same table that had been the heart of this home for decades. I didn't ease into it. I didn't soften the blow. I laid it all out. I told her about the property assessment, about finding David's documents detailing his plan to take the house and put me in a nursing home, about the recordings I had of their conversations, about the fraudulent loan application, about everything. Sarah's face went through so many emotions, I couldn't track them all. Shock, denial, anger, guilt, fear. She tried to interrupt multiple times, but I held up my hand and kept talking. I told her I had lawyers involved, I had evidence, I had already protected my assets and my legal rights. I told her David was going to face criminal charges, and I told her she needed to decide right now whether she was with him or with me. When I finally stopped talking, Sarah was crying, not delicate tears, but gut-wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She said she didn't know. She said she knew David had been talking about the house, about planning for the future, but she didn't realize the extent of what he was doing. She said he told her they were just being smart, just preparing for inevitabilities, just making sure the family would be taken care of. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted so badly to believe my daughter was innocent in all this. But I'd seen her go along with too much. I'd heard her make excuses for David too many times. I'd watched her choose him over me again and again. So I asked her directly, did you know about the loan application? Did you know he was planning to put me in a nursing home? Did you know he was trying to get power of attorney to control my money? She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. She said she knew David had gotten some financial papers for me to sign. She knew he'd been looking into senior living facilities. She knew he'd talked to a real estate agent about selling the house. She tried to frame it as concern for my well-being, as planning for my future care. But she knew. Maybe not every detail, but she knew enough. She'd chosen to ignore the warning signs because it was easier than confronting her husband. I felt something break inside me. My daughter, the little girl I'd raised, the baby I'd delivered with my own hands, had chosen a con artist over her own father, had chosen comfort and convenience over integrity, had let me be victimized in my own home because standing up for me would have been difficult. I told her she had 24 hours to decide. She could leave David, file for divorce, and I'd help her and Ethan get set up in a new place. I'd support her through the mess that was coming, or she could stay with him, and I'd consider her complicit in everything he'd done. If she chose him, she'd be cut out of my life completely. No inheritance, no relationship, no grandfather for Ethan. She'd be dead to me, the same way David already was. Sarah begged me not to make her choose. She said she loved David. They had a child together. She couldn't just throw away her marriage. She said David made mistakes, but he wasn't a bad person. He was just stressed about money, about providing for their family. She made excuses for him even as I laid out evidence of his crimes. She chose him. Right there, in that moment, she chose the man who was trying to destroy her father over the father who'd given her everything. I stood up from that table and walked away, went to my room, closed the door, and let myself feel the full weight of that loss. I'd already lost Margaret. Now I was losing Sarah too. Not to death, but to something worse. to willful blindness, to cowardice, to greed. When David came home Sunday evening, the house was silent and tense. Sarah had obviously told him about our conversation because he looked at me with undisguised hatred. No more pretense of the concerned son-in-law, no more fake smiles, just pure animosity. He knew I'd discovered everything, and he knew I was planning to destroy him, but he didn't know exactly what evidence I had or what my next move would be. That uncertainty must have been killing him. Monday morning, I called James and told him to proceed with everything, file the police report, issue the cease and desist, prepare the restraining order. I was done playing games. It was time to end this. James filed the police report that afternoon. By Tuesday morning, 2 detectives showed up at the house. They asked to speak with David privately. I watched from my bedroom window as they questioned him in the driveway for over an hour, watched his body language shift from confident to defensive to panicked, watched him lie and backpedal and try to explain away the unexplainable. The detectives left without arresting him, but they told him they'd be conducting a full investigation. They took his phone, his laptop, his briefcase. They told him not to leave town. They told him he'd likely be facing charges for identity theft, fraud, and attempted larceny. His face when they drove away was the face of a man watching his life collapse in real time. Sarah came to my room an hour later. She was crying again, mascara running down her face, looking destroyed. She said the detectives had questions for her too, asked what she knew about David's activities. She'd told them she didn't know anything, which was a lie. She was protecting him even as the walls closed in. She asked me to drop the charges, to please not destroy her family. I looked at my daughter and I barely recognized her. This woman who was willing to lie to the police to protect a man who'd committed crimes against her own father, this woman who valued her marriage more than justice, more than integrity, more than me. I told her no. I told her David had made his choices and now he'd face the consequences. I told her she'd made her choices too, and she'd have to live with those. She said I was being cruel, said I was tearing the family apart, said Ethan deserved to have his father. I told her David should have thought about that before he tried to steal from his son's grandfather. I told her that families are built on trust and respect, and David had destroyed both. I told her she'd chosen her side, and now she'd have to live on it. Sarah left my room, and I heard her and David packing, heard them arguing in fierce whispers, heard Ethan crying, confused by the tension and chaos. Part of me wanted to stop them, wanted to fix this somehow, wanted to find a way to save my relationship with my daughter, but I knew it was too late. She'd made her choice. She'd picked the wrong side, and there was no coming back from that. They moved out that evening, loaded their car with suitcases and boxes, with Ethan's toys and their belongings. Sarah wouldn't look at me as they left. David glared at me with pure hatred. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away, taking my grandson with them, and I felt hollow. The house was empty again, just like after Margaret died, but somehow this felt worse. Margaret's absence was tragic, but natural. Sarah's absence was a choice, a betrayal, a loss that didn't have to happen. Over the next few weeks, the legal system ground forward. The district attorney's office decided to prosecute David for fraud and identity theft. The bank's evidence was too strong to ignore. His trial date was set for 6 months out. James filed a civil lawsuit on my behalf seeking damages for emotional distress and attempted theft. We also filed for a restraining order, which was granted, prohibiting David from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. David lost his job. When his employer found out about the criminal charges, they terminated him immediately. Sales positions require trust, and a pending fraud case destroys that. He couldn't find other work. Who would hire someone facing felony charges for stealing from their own family? Sarah had to go back to work full-time to support them. She called me once, 3 weeks after they'd moved out, crying and desperate. said they couldn't afford rent and groceries, said Ethan needed new clothes for preschool, asked if I could help them financially. The audacity of that request, after everything that had happened, actually made me laugh. I told her no. I told her she'd chosen David, and David's consequences were now her consequences. Then I hung up. I found out later they'd moved in with David's parents 2 hours away, living in a basement apartment, both working multiple jobs to pay legal fees and debt. Everything they'd hoped to gain by stealing from me, they'd lost by trying. They'd destroyed their lives for nothing. The criminal trial happened 8 months after that first police report. I testified, told the jury everything, showed them the evidence, the recordings, the documents. David's attorney tried to paint me as a confused old man who'd misunderstood innocent attempts to help, but James had prepared me well. I was sharp, clear, competent on the stand. I answered every question with precision. I provided dates, times, details. I showed that jury exactly who I was. A sound-minded man who'd been systematically victimized by someone he'd trusted. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced David to 3 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution of $50,000, the amount he'd tried to steal. He'd never have that kind of money. It would hang over him for the rest of his life. Sarah was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I saw her face crumble when they said guilty, saw her shoulders shake as they led David away in handcuffs. She'd stood by him through everything, and now she'd be alone, raising Ethan by herself for at least the next 3 years. Maybe longer, with parole considerations. She approached me outside the courthouse after, said she understood now that she'd been wrong, said she should have listened to me, should have believed me, said she was sorry, said she wanted to fix our relationship, wanted Ethan to know his grandfather. It sounded sincere. Maybe it even was sincere. But it was too late. I told her I appreciated the apology, but words didn't undo actions. She'd had chances to do the right thing. She'd had opportunities to stand up for me. She'd chosen David every single time until the consequences made that choice untenable. Her apology now wasn't about genuine remorse. It was about needing help, needing support, needing the safety net she'd helped try to steal from me. I told her I'd set up a trust fund for Ethan. When he turned 18, he'd have access to money for college or trade school or whatever he wanted to do with his life. But I wouldn't have a relationship with him while he was young, because that would require having a relationship with her, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't look at her without seeing her complicity, her betrayal, her choice to side with a criminal over her own father. She cried and begged, but I walked away, got in my car, and drove back to my house. The house I'd built with Margaret, the house I'd nearly lost, the house I'd fought for and won. The civil case settled 6 months later. David's parents paid $50,000 to make it go away, probably mortgaging their own home to do it. They wanted to protect their son from even more financial destruction, wanted to limit the damage to their own family. I didn't care about the money. It was never about money. It was about justice. It was about making sure David paid for what he'd tried to do. James helped me set up that trust fund for Ethan, using the settlement money. When Ethan turns 18, he'll have enough for a good education. He'll have a chance at a better life than his father could give him. And maybe when he's old enough to understand, I'll tell him this story. I'll tell him about his grandfather who fought back, about the importance of integrity and boundaries, about what happens when you try to take what isn't yours. That was 15 years ago. David got out of prison 12 years back after serving his sentence. I heard he's working in a warehouse now, living in a small rental, barely scraping by. His criminal record makes it nearly impossible to get decent employment. The $50,000 his parents paid will hang over him forever, debt he'll probably never be able to repay them. His marriage to Sarah somehow survived, though I can't imagine what kind of relationship they have now, built on that foundation of crime and consequence. Sarah sent me cards for years, Christmas cards, birthday cards, photos of Ethan growing up. I never responded. Eventually, the cards stopped coming. Maybe she finally accepted that I meant what I said. Maybe she moved on. Maybe she finally understood that some choices have permanent consequences. Ethan turned 18 3 years ago in 2022. I had James reach out to him through the trust, letting him know about the college fund his grandfather had set up for him. Ethan used it to go to trade school, became an electrician, just like my friend Tommy, who helped me wire this house 63 years ago. That made me smile when I heard it. The kid has good instincts, chose a solid profession, chose to work with his hands. Maybe he got that from me, even though we never met. I'm 79 years old now. I live alone in the house Margaret and I built, surrounded by memories of what we created together. Tommy passed away 5 years ago, but his son visits me sometimes, checks in on me, makes sure I'm doing okay. James retired last year, but he still calls every few months just to catch up. I have a quiet life. Simple, but good. The master bedroom is exactly as it was when Margaret died. I haven't changed a single thing. Her clothes still hang in the closet. Her jewelry box still sits on the dresser. Her side of the bed is still made up with her favorite pillows. Some people might think that's morbid, but I don't care. This room is a shrine to the woman I loved, to the life we built, to the sacrifice we made together. No one will ever take this from me again. I spend a lot of time thinking about what I learned through all of this, about trust and betrayal, about family and loyalty, about the difference between being kind and being foolish. Margaret and I raised Sarah to be compassionate, to help family, to be generous. We thought we were teaching her good values, but somewhere along the way, those values got twisted. She learned that family means accepting anything, forgiving everything, supporting people even when they're wrong. That's not what we meant to teach her. Real love, real family, real loyalty requires boundaries. It requires standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It requires choosing integrity over comfort. Sarah failed that test. She chose the easy path, the path that let her avoid conflict and difficulty, and that choice cost her everything that actually mattered. David thought he was smart, thought he'd found an easy mark, a grieving old man who could be manipulated and controlled. Thought wrong. He underestimated me because he saw age and grief as weakness. He didn't understand that you don't survive 8 decades on this earth. Don't build a house with your bare hands. Don't work construction for 45 years. Don't bury your wife and keep living without developing strength that goes deeper than muscle. The revenge I took on David wasn't violence. It wasn't rage. It was patience, documentation, and the legal system. It was letting him commit his crimes and hanging himself with his own rope. It was being smarter, more prepared, more strategic than he ever imagined I could be. And it worked. He lost everything: his freedom, his job, his reputation, his future. He'll carry those felony convictions for the rest of his life. Every job application, every apartment rental, every background check will reveal what he tried to do. His crime will follow him forever. That's real revenge, not a moment of violent satisfaction that fades, not an emotional outburst that accomplishes nothing, but permanent life-altering consequences that serve as a reminder every single day of what happens when you betray trust and try to steal from people who've shown you nothing but kindness. I want anyone listening to this story to understand something crucial. Being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. Being grieving doesn't mean being vulnerable to exploitation. Having family doesn't mean accepting abuse. You have rights, you have options, you have power, even when people try to convince you that you don't. If you're in a situation like mine, if someone is trying to take advantage of you, if you feel pressured or manipulated or violated in your own home, fight back. Document everything. Find allies, get legal help. Don't be ashamed to protect yourself. Don't let anyone convince you that standing up for yourself is mean or cruel or ungrateful. Protecting what you've worked for isn't selfish. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. Demanding respect isn't unreasonable. The biggest mistake I made was waiting so long to act. I saw the warning signs for years before I finally took David seriously as a threat. I made excuses for him because he was family, because I didn't want to believe someone could be that calculating and cruel. I let my grief and loneliness make me passive. If I'd acted sooner, maybe I could have saved my relationship with Sarah. Maybe I could have stopped David before he committed actual crimes. Maybe things could have ended differently, but maybe not. Maybe Sarah was always going to choose David. Maybe David was always going to escalate until he faced real consequences. Maybe this was the only way it could have ended. I'll never know. What I do know is this: I won. I kept my house, I protected my assets, I held on to my dignity and autonomy. I made sure that the man who tried to destroy me faced justice. That matters. In a world where elder abuse is rampant, where family members steal from vulnerable relatives every single day, where the legal system often fails to protect victims, I fought back and won. This house still stands. The house Margaret and I built with our own hands, with our love and sacrifice and dreams. Every room still holds our memories. Every wall still echoes with her laughter. Every corner still feels like home, and it's mine. Completely, totally, legally mine. No one can take it. No one can steal it. No one can manipulate me out of it. I walk through these rooms sometimes, touching the walls, remembering Margaret painting the kitchen yellow because it made her happy, remembering Sarah's first steps across this living room floor, remembering the years of joy and love and family that these walls witnessed. Those memories are bittersweet now, tainted by what came after, but they're still real. They still matter. And I remember the look on David's face when the guilty verdict was read. That moment when he realized he'd lost, that his plan had failed, that he'd destroyed his own life for nothing. That memory doesn't bring me joy, exactly, but it brings satisfaction. The deep bone-level satisfaction of justice served, of wrong punished, of victory earned through patience and strategy, and refusing to be a victim. Some people might think I'm bitter, lonely, might think I should have forgiven Sarah, rebuilt our relationship, let Ethan into my life while he was young. And maybe I am bitter, maybe I am lonely, but I'm also right. What they did was wrong, and forgiveness without accountability is just enabling. Sarah needed to live with her choices. She needed to understand that actions have consequences. But for now, I'm okay with this. I'm okay with my quiet life, in my house, with my memories. I'm okay with the solitude and the silence. I survived poverty and loss and betrayal. I built something beautiful and fought to keep it. I honored Margaret's memory by protecting what we created together. That's enough. That has to be enough. To anyone listening who's facing something similar, you're stronger than you think. You're smarter than they believe. You have more power than they want you to know. Don't let anyone steal your life's work. Don't let anyone manipulate you into giving up what you've earned. Don't let anyone convince you that protecting yourself is wrong. Stand up, fight back, document everything, find good lawyers, trust your instincts, and when the time comes, show no mercy to those who showed you none. Not with violence, but with the cold, hard application of the law and the consequences they've earned through their own actions. Your dignity is worth fighting for. Your home is worth protecting. Your legacy is worth preserving. And you are worth more than anyone who tries to exploit you will ever understand. I'm 79 years old. I live alone in the house I built, and I won. Remember that. When you're facing down people who think you're weak, who think you're confused, who think you're an easy target, you can win. You just have to be willing to fight. Margaret would be proud of me. I know she would. I protected what we built. I stood up for myself. I refused to be a victim. And in the end, when they'd taken so much from me, when they'd tried to take everything, I fought back and won. That's my story. That's my revenge. Not loud, not violent, but total, complete, devastating to those who tried to destroy me and vindicating for the man who refused to give up. This house still stands, and so do I.